Hello. So I decided to have a look at the question of the false positive rate. You may have heard some people say that of all the positive cases, this is Britain, the UK, supposedly there's actually quite a substantial amount of false positives. Some people have said as high as like 90%, others 50%. Um, and I'll go into the details of why they say that. I've just had a good old data dive, just a quick give you the conclusion of what I found. This is very rough numbers, but this is something like this. It's more like maybe 10% of all of the positive cases are false positive. This is the positive rate graph, not the cases graph. And about 10% of those are about, or 12.13, that's rough maths, and I'll show you how I did it later, but around about 10 to 15% are false positives. I'm about 80% confident that that number's about right. I'm not a statistician. And I'm going to show you how I worked it out so you can see. I'm fairly confident, but not. There's some places where I could have made errors, so that's not set in stone. And I think if I did make errors, it's more likely to actually be smaller than that, than higher. So that's the headline, and I'm actually a little bit surprised. In my videos on coronavirus, I talk about never knowing whether we've overreacted or underreacted, and I kind of swing back and forth. And generally, I think we've overreacted, but this is one of those situations where it was like, okay, I've had to eat a tinsy piece of humble pie, maybe just a little, although not massive, but a little, because I thought it was going to be more than that, and it's actually a little bit less. But that's still a substantial chunk of false positives, and it's not the 1% or under 1% that sometimes Matt Hancock says or some people say. I don't think it's as low as that. It is still like a big chunk of false positives. Yeah. So I'm just going to walk you through how I've worked that out, and I've done some pretty nutty maths. All of this data here is just me going nuts. So I'm going to walk you through the whole thing. So quite often you go, this graph gets seen on the media, gets shown on the media all the time. The cases graph, and you see this first wave, and then you see this massive second wave. And I don't like this. To me, this graph has always seemed kind of almost meaningless, because you don't know how many tests are being taken, and so it looks really bad. But obviously, they're taking way more tests. So the first step is to not look at that graph, because this is how many tests are being taken here. This blue is all the amount of tests in the UK that are being taken. I got this from this website, Government UK, number of tests being taken. There it is, all the way up there. And then this is the proportion of those tests that are coming up positive. So quite a small proportion, but that pink at the bottom there is the cases. And really you want to find out what proportion of those tests are coming up positive, and to do that you go to the positive rate graph, which is this one. And you can get this from our world in Data.org, and here it is. Here, this is the positive rate. So this is the number of tests that come up positive, the rate, per the number of tests that are taken, how many of them are positive, and this is the rate. So this is the first wave, and this is the second wave. And for a while, I'd basically just been following this. I thought this was a much more accurate reading of the virus. So there's the first wave, much worse, and then the second wave, much less. But even this graph isn't perfect. There's more to be said about this. I had something to say about this one. Let me just see what it was. So we'll go to that in a minute. So there is more to say about this graph though, because in April and May they had less tests. They had less tests, which means that they were probably focusing the tests that they were doing on a portion of the population that were far more likely to have the virus, and therefore you're more likely to have higher percentage there anyway. Whereas the more tests you do, the wider the scope of the testing. You go testing a much broader chunk of the population, so it's going to be less likely that they'll have the coronavirus. But even all of this, you're probably going to have more people. It's probably going to be, testing is going to generally, you're going to test people who are more likely to have the virus than not. The people who are asymptomatic, the people who don't have problems, they're not going to go. People who aren't in high risk situations, they're not going to get the tests. So this will probably come down lower, and this is probably a bit lower. And a way to understand this I found that's helpful is to think of the whole map of the United Kingdom and think of a spotlight, flying over the country. And when you don't have many tests, the spotlight is very narrow and very bright, and it's just kind of on a single focus. And the narrower it is, the more it kind of attracts, the brighter it is, so the more it attracts the moths to the flame kind of thing. And inside that spotlight, you have a picture of a little chunk of Britain and how many people inside of that spotlight have coronavirus. It shows up. But you've got to remember, the narrower it is, the more it's going to attract moths to the flame. But when you get more testing, the spotlight widens, and now you can shine this big spotlight across the UK, and you can see inside the spotlight, you can see how many people have coronavirus. And again, it's still attracting moths to the flames, but less so, because it's not quite as bright, not quite so focused. And inside the spotlight, you're kind of seeing, okay, if this is the percentage of people who have a coronavirus in this spotlight, you can assume that that's probably the case everywhere. That was one way I looked at it. Anyway, so that was the graph I was looking at, and I kind of figured it's probably that's a bit lower and that's a bit lower. And then I found out about the prevalence data. So this is actually probably what the real situation looks like. This is what you want. So that blue there, that's actually how it folds. That's that's probably closest to the real situation. Let me just lower that a bit. So that's closer to the real situation here, and I'll show you why I think that's the case. So it's a very low. So it wasn't 30% of the population. It was actually more like 0.3%. It's like 10 times less. But it has gone up higher there. And that blue at the bottom there, the prevalence, is that graph there. So it is wide. So it actually does look like that graph, the first graph. So all the while I was thinking that's not very good to look at. It actually probably is. Now this prevalence data, basically this is what I thought they should have been doing from the start. And I couldn't find this data for ages. Let me just have a look. A few previous releases. Oh, they have been releasing it. I couldn't find it though. Or maybe I didn't look hard enough, or I found it now anyway. This is random testing of the population. This is, I think so. This is their methods, and they basically they've been sending out in the UK random tests to households across the country, and they've just been doing PCR swab tests, send them back in, and from this they've estimated the prevalence of the coronavirus in the country as a whole. So this avoids the spotlight effect of attracting moths to the flame, pretty much, because this is just a random testing of the population. You could argue that there's still a certain type of person who would be most likely to participate in a survey like this compared with others. The people that participate are probably more likely to be pro-lockdown, let's get rid of this coronavirus thing. But then if that's the case, you would think the numbers would be less, I think. But anyway, it's probably pretty fair. I think it's pretty fair. It's pretty random. It's pretty good. And that's the prevalence. It's like 0.3 there, And then it's got up to, at worst, it was about 2% in the winter. And so to get another kind of view of that, where's my graphs? Did I get rid of my graphs? Oh man, my graphs. I did a graph. Oh, I might have put it right down the bottom. Did I move it right down the bottom? Yes, I did. There. So that's the prevalence. Got to zoom out. So that's the whole population. This graph shows you the whole population, 100% of the population. That is what they're saying is the extent to which coronavirus is in the population. Now, I don't want to minimize, excuse that, don't ignore that spike there. That was just to get the graph in the chart in perspective. I don't mean to minimize it either, but this also is accurate in the sense of perspective of that is, because sometimes you feel like everywhere you go in the world, in the country, you know, there's just coronavirus everywhere. But actually that's the extent, the true extent of it at the moment. So it's pretty small. And so, yeah, so this prevalence data, I think I trust the most. It's random testing. Yeah. So, yeah, there's the positive rate graph, and then it's actually much lower than that. That's the true percentage of people who have it. And then this graph, so that's the prevalence. And then, so there's the prevalence there. And then that blue, you can just see a tiny little blue at the bottom there. That's the number of cases. So that is the cases graph there. So here's what they think the prevalence is in the population. Up to 2% there, 1%, 0.32%. And then this is the actual number of cases they found of that. So that's basically saying that this blue along the bottom here, these are the positive cases that they've actually found. This is the number of people who haven't been tested who have the virus. This is what they reckon. They reckon all of these people here are just walking around or suffering in silence at home or whatever, who have the virus and just haven't been tested. These are just the ones they found. So there's quite a lot of people who have the, well, you know, that's what you'd expect, I think. There's a lot of people who have the virus but haven't been tested. They're just the ones they found. Yes, so, and then, what was that? Yeah, that one's that. And let me go back down to the bottom because I had some interesting graphs here that kind of went a bit further with it. So that's prevalence, 100% of the population, that's it spreading there. And then of that, so that's the number of people who have coronavirus in the country. Then you got, if you zoom into that there, this is the prevalence here. This is the number of all of those people who have it. This is the number of people who actually get admitted to hospital, this blue line. And as you can see, it barely comes off the bottom. You can barely even see it. It's a tiny little percentage of people who have the coronavirus actually get admitted to hospital. And again, I don't want to minimize that we've had more excess deaths in 2020 than any year. I don't want to minimize it in that sense. People have died, but at the same time, I like getting perspective and putting things in context, you know, because it does get blown up a bit. And this is the truth of the data. That's the prevalence in out of the whole population. And then you zoom in, and this is the amount of people who get the coronavirus who go to hospital, and it's a tiny little, you know, think there. And this is the amount of people who die, which it doesn't even show up really. And then there's another graph. What did I do with it here? So this is good. So if you zoom into this blue line here, the number of people who actually go to hospital, it looks like this. And there's the blue line. That's how many people go to hospital. And then that red line, pink line, is the number of people who die from it. And this green turquoisey line is the number of people who are on mechanical ventilator beds. So when you look at this graph, now look, this is still like thousands of people dying. So this is why I don't want to minimize it. It is bad. But when you kind of zoom out from there to there to there, this is the whole population. That's the number. That's the prevalence of coronavirus in the country. This is your chances of going to hospital. Tinsy little slither, and then this is your chances of dying of that. I don't know if that puts it in perspective or not. It might do. Hopefully it does. But this still represents thousands of people. So that's still bad and it's still serious. The people on mechanical beds is quite surprising because that's pretty much everybody. It's got a bit of a delay, which you would probably expect. So people are going to hospital and then a few days, like a week or so later, they go into ventilator beds. This is presuming I haven't misunderstood the data, but it seems to be that almost everybody that gets admitted to hospital ends up in a mechanical ventilator bed, which seems surprising to me. I've got the data from, again, the government website here, healthcare, all from here. Mechanical ventilation beds, 3,277 admitted to hospital, about 3,000, bit less than that, about the same as that. So yeah, that's quite surprising. And then the amount of people who die, who end up getting admitted to hospital, is, I think it worked out at about 40-odd%, something like that, which that seems quite high as well. But again, that's the death rate per the number of people who go to the hospital. The number of people who get the virus who die is like, the infection fatality rate is like nearer to 0.4, I think, 0.3, 0.5ish, something like that. So yes, anyway, so that's just getting some perspective. And then back to the false positive rate. I almost just looked into the false positive rate out of just curiosity, because really all you need to know is that prevalence rate. I think that's the main chart you want to know anyway, the prevalence rate. But I was just curious to answer the question. So here we go. Let's show you how I worked it out. So, so people say it could be as high as 90. It's kind of confusing. So when people say you got this test and it's got a 1% false positive rate, people kind of think there's all your cases, so 1% of them is like a tinsy tiny slither, no problem. But it's more like, not quite like this, but it's more like 1% of the tests being taken. That's what he's saying, is 1% of the tests being taken. So if you look at this graph, here's all the tests being taken, and that little pink bit, that's the positive cases. Well, 1% of all these tests being taken actually shows up more like about 20% of those cases, if you can imagine that. 1% of all these tests being taken actually shows up as about 20% of those cases. It's more like something like that. That's not quite how it is, but it's actually kind of constitutes a bit more of a substantial chunk. And there's a calculator to work it out though. So that's how I was thinking about it before. But there's there are these calculators to work out how you work it out, and I'll just run you through it. I wanted this video to be quick, but it's so complicated. I'm just gonna have to show you it. So I cooked these up. There's a calculator here that shows you how to do it, but it only goes up to 100 people, and it's not quite as accurate. And I found this, of all places, through the Huff Post, which I don't really generally read. I think they're a bit too left-leaning for me, but they made some good arguments here. I think they were actually right here. And again, I try not to pick sides politically and all this kind of stuff. I just want to follow the truth, and I generally like going to both sides of an argument to try and test your arguments through fire. Go to the left and the right, see the arguments from both sides, and then you can figure out the truth. So anyway, this is how you do it. So if you have, this is the LFR, this is the lateral flow rate, there's the PCR, max PCR min. So this is a, how do I say this? There's your population, there's the prevalence, sensitivity and specificity. This is the test. So let's say you've got a population of 10,000 people. 10,000 people, and the prevalence, which we know from the random testing now, so that's like the accurate number of what it is. Let's say the prevalence in the population is 10%, something. So at the moment, that means that of a population of 10,000 people, let me zoom in a little bit. Not that much. In a population of 10,000 people, 1,000 people have coronavirus and 9,000 people don't. Then you get your test. So let's just say this is the test. Don't worry about the LFR, it can be any old test. And let's say that the sensitivity is 75% and the specificity is 90%. Sensitivity is of the proportion of people who have the coronavirus, so that's 1,000 people. The test sensitivity is the proportion of people it accurately, correctly finds as being having coronavirus. So it have a positive result. So if you've got 1,000 people in the community have coronavirus, and this test correctly finds 750 people and gives them a positive result on the test, that means it's got a 75% sensitivity, which means 250 of those people, those 1,000 people, got a negative result on the test, even though they're actually positive. So that's a false negative there. And then the specificity is the opposite. It's the how many people who don't have the coronavirus, how many people does the test accurately find? So if it's 90% specificity, then that means of the 9,000 people who don't have the coronavirus, 8,100 of them will be accurately found and given a negative result on the test, which means there'll be 900 people who will get a positive result on the test, but they don't have the virus. And then you just work out, so you've got these all your positives. You've got 750 positive, 900 false positive. And so what proportion of those positives were false? Well, it's that divided by the total, 54.55% in this example. And basically, let's go back to how it was. So, basically, if you've got sensitivity, it does get so. Yeah. So if you've got a, hang on, what do I want to say next? So that's it. This is your lateral flow tests, and then these are the PCR tests. So this is what I want to say next. Lateral flow tests. This is where you find the. So this is from the government website. Lateral flow tests, and the sensitivity and specificity. The specificity was 99.68, and the overall sensitivity was 76.8. So I used that data. That seemed to be fairly okay. And then the PCR, I got this data from here because this is the stuff they were using on this one. And it says test sensitivity and specificity. The sensitivity was between 85 and 98, and the specificity was at least 99.9. I think it's they said, you know, there was one time where even if all of these positives were false, it would still be 99.92 in this example. So I basically came up with a minimum PCR and a maximum PCR. And the minimum, I put the 85% sensitivity and I put it 99.9. That's the minimum. Then the max, I put it 98% sensitivity and 99.99 specificity. It could even be higher than that, but I don't know. But I thought that was a fairly fair max range. Yeah, and then they're my calculators, and then you just change the prevalence, whatever the prevalence is. And what you'll see is that when the prevalence is low in the population, the chances of having a false positive are very high. There's the LFR, 56%, and it was as low as that sometimes. It's currently, what is it currently? Where's the prevalence? There. It's currently 1.28. So that's semi-high. Although it's probably lower than that. Oh no, it's probably about right. 1.28. So at the moment it's about 1.28% prevalence. So you've got about a quarter of a chance that if you do an LFR test that you're going to get a false positive. And with the PCR test, it's probably somewhere between those two. So maybe 4% chance you get a false positive. But the lower it gets, the lower the prevalence in the population, the higher your chances of getting a false positive. Whereas when it's quite high, the prevalence, 2% was the highest, gets to about 16.96. Unless you're testing, like in the early days, when I said they focus on people, testing people who are much more likely to have it, then the prevalence is actually going to be higher than that. I mean, I don't know. It could be 5-10%. I don't know. But maybe more, maybe less. I don't know. So yeah, your chances of getting false positives goes down a lot more. Anyway, so that's your false positives, and then I basically crunched the data. So this is what I did. So the other thing I needed to work out then was the proportion of you got all the tests that have been taken in the UK. I need to know the proportion of those tests that were PCR and the proportion that were LFR. And here I found it here again, all off of the government website. You've got, this is the total number of tests taken, and you can get this data. I've got it. And then this is the number of tests taken that are PCR. That's the number of tests taken that are PCR. And then I just basically presumed that the number of tests that weren't PCR must have been the LFR, lateral flow rate tests. Because this is, all these tests are pillar 1, 2 and 4. And we've got these 4 pillars here, 1, 2 and 4. And pillar 3 is something else. It's serology testing to look for antibodies, and it's not, they don't list it in those tests, so I just ignored the whole thing. So, and I'm just trying to get average numbers here. Yeah, so I just presumed that the tests that weren't done by PCR must have been LFR. Now that's an error. That might have been a place where I made a mistake. There could have been some other tests, but I don't think so. I can't think of any. I mean, maybe there are, but I don't know. I don't know of any. So that was the gist. So where is all my data? Here it comes over here somewhere, I think. There it is. So here's the total tests taken. So I've got all these graphs in the way. These are all the tests taken, and then yep, here it is. So these are all the tests taken every day, and these are the proportion of those tests that were PCR. So what you will see, and this is, I think, the lateral flow rate, lateral LFR. This is what I assumed was the LFR. And what you'll see from the early days, there were no LFR tests. It was all PCR. So in the early days, it was just pretty much exclusively PCR. And then this is around about mid-October. They just started doing the LFR tests. Which you might remember, they opened up the drop-in centres where you could drive in and get your tests. You know, this is like October they started doing this, and then they started sending them out to places, so it became more common. So this is the proportion of the total tests that aren't PCR, and I'm assuming they're LFR. And here in these two columns is the percentage proportion. So, you know, at first it was just 100%. PCR, 0% LFR. Then as it comes into October, November, the proportion starts changing, and we end up close to like 50-50 basically. And this is just a graph of 100%. These are all the tests. This is how many tests were PCR tests. And then here is about October, and we start seeing the lateral flow tests. These white, just imagine this gap here. These are the lateral flow tests. Now we're on about 50-50, but basically it's been pretty much PCR tests the whole way. But we're starting to do some lateral flow tests. And remember that the PCR tests are much more accurate. You don't get as many false positives. The LFR rates, LFR is you get much higher false positives on that. So I had to take that data, and as you can see, I went mental with it all. I had so much data coming out of my head. It's hard to keep on top of it all, but I went through that data. So that was the percentage PCR, percentage LFR, and then I had to work out the percentage. So you've got all these tests, this many are PCR, this many are LFR. Then I want to work out the false positive rate at each moment. So this is the LFR. This was the false positive rate at this moment because I have the prevalence. I have the prevalence of 0.32. So I can put 0.32 into all of these calculators, and I can work out the false positive rate. So 0.32, let me just show you so you don't think I'm lying. 0.32, 56.48, 3.08, 26.82, and where is it over here? I've lost it already. I've gone too far. There it is, 56.48, 3.08, 26.82. That's the false positive rate. And then I worked out, so these are all the tests taken. These are all the cases. 4,767 cases on that day. And then I worked out what proportion of those cases were false positives. Well, at this point, there was no LFR. No LFR. But we did have PCRs. And so I've worked out the min and the max, and then I did an average in between of those two, so the mid-range. And that's the mid-range. And then as we go down towards the end, all the way through, this is the number of cases. Is that right? Oh yeah, that's right. So yeah. So no, this is that's your PCR cases. That's your PCR LFR cases. That's your total number of cases is 12,492. And I worked out, yeah. So basically, AN and AW. Where is that? Let's go back here. AN and AW. AW is the percentage of the that's PCR, and then AN is the number of cases. Yes, so you've got the number of cases. I hope you're still with me. Multiplied by the percentage that was PCR. So you got, if you had 100 cases and it's 50-50 PCR, you multiply it by 50 and you get 50 cases, and then the LFR will be the opposite of that basically. Well, I probably just multiplied it by the LFR rate, so that's it. So there's all your numbers, and so this is how many cases were positive cases that were used with a PCR test and were found with a PCR test, and this is the number of positive cases that were found with an LFR test. So now I have that partitioned like that. I can now find out the false positive rate. So I have the false positive rate there. So yeah, there it is, and it's like, so I multiply that by the false positive rate there, and it comes up to there, and then I do a mid range and a max range, and then that's the middle, min, max, and then middle there of those two, and then I add them together. there, and then add them together with the min, LFR plus the PCR min, LFR plus PCR max, and then LFR was PCR and did the mid. So that's basically the end one. That's basically how many false positives there are. So out of, there was 4,767 positive cases found on this day, wherever what day that is, on the 21st of April. 713 of them were false positives, probably. Yeah, probably, according to the calculator. And again, you go through the whole list, all the way through. These are all the false positives that came up then. So that's how I've worked out the false positives. A total of 328,435 false positives out of about, how many cases? 4 million? Something like that. Should we find out the proportion of that? Just out of curiosity. Equals that divided by that. It's about 404 million or something like that. Oh look, the value's too big. Come on, you cheeky monkey. Is that too big? Why is that not working? Is the number too big? Let's do a percent. Let's just keep it 2 decimals. Why isn't that working? Equals that divided by that. I don't know why. I'm going to do it by calculator. 328,435 divided by 4 million times by 100. 8.21%. 8.21%. Yeah, so that could be about right. I mean, but then there's more to be said about that, so that might not be quite right. But because I had the 12% range. Anyway, so they're all your false positives. And then you just work out the proportion of those false positives of all the positives. And you whack them in a graph. And I don't think I need to go for it. I mean, yeah, it's just more boring maths. So here's all your cases. These are all your positive cases, and this is the proportion that are false positives. Little line along there. You've got the upper range, the minimum range, and then there's the mid range. That blue. There's your cases there. And again, so it is about 10%. That was said 8.7 was the average. And this is the other graph. Again, around about 10%ish. Now, I think it's a bit more than 8% because here it skews the data a little bit, because actually if that skewed the data you would have thought it'd lift it up higher. So I don't know, but there's like 50% there along that bit because the prevalence is so low. The false positive rate was about 50% here. Maybe you can add it. I don't know. It's about 10%. And one other thing to say about this though is that again, so here in March, April and May, the likelihood, see, I've used the prevalence of the population, household population at large, whereas these tests being taken were not random tests, neither were these even, but particularly these weren't random tests. These were much more likely to have the coronavirus, and therefore the prevalence in the population that was being tested, the portion of the population being tested, the prevalence would have been much higher, most likely. And so the graph would probably look a little bit more like that. Maybe even less, I don't know, but it's just a little less than that. I didn't adjust this bit here. I don't think it would make a huge amount of difference here, even though it's a slightly more focused here than the wider population. It's about 10%, something like that. So, and then see that 12.13% is very dodgy maths. That was just me guessing. I basically just chopped out all of that because I thought that skewed the data a bit, the 50 to 150 bit. I just kind of figured out a rough idea of what proportion that made up of all of that and what proportion that made up of all of that. And it was about 12.13%. So I don't know, it's about 10%. So anyway, that was quite complicated to have to kind of explain. This is I'm not a mathematician or a statistician, so yeah, but I do feel like I have done it properly. I figured out how to figure out the prevalence, the false positive rate using these calculators, and I worked out the proportion of all the tests taken that were PCR and which were LFR. I think that seems fairly accurate. And then I've done all the maths and worked out the proportion of tests that are false positive, and it comes out at about that many. So less than the 1% that some people, Matt Hancock was saying, it's tiny little 1%. No, it is a chunk. There's a chunk. It's probably more like about 10%. But it's not the 50 or 90% some people were saying. Now it was 50 round here. It did get to at its biggest, at its max, it got to about 50%. Where is it all here? So here, like 50% here, 47, 33%. This is in June, July, August. It was in the 50s and 40s, 40% range. But again, I kind of feel like this earlier data that could have been skewed a little bit, because if you come back here, the early data was like 0.32% prevalence. It said 0.32% prevalence from the wider population, whereas the testing that was being done in April and May was far more likely to be on people who had the virus. And so what kind of rate would you expect there? Your chances, now I don't think it would be, you might think, oh gosh, 50-50, something like that, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, there was still, even when they were testing there, even when they were testing here, this is all the tests they were doing, still only a slither. You can't even see it on here. A tiny proportion, well, it's 30%, isn't it? But it's we're coming up positive. So I don't think it was that prevalent. Yeah, I don't know. If it was like 30% prevalence there, then the false positive rate would have been tiny. Well, it wasn't. They wasn't using LFR. It was just PCR, so it would have been tiny. So I don't think it's that high though. Might have been about 5%, something like that. Yeah. Some of this stuff is hard to get your head around. Like I wonder whether if the positive rate was 30%, then does that mean that the prevalence in that proportion of the population was 30%? Is that basically what it means? That doesn't seem quite right. I feel like I don't know. I have to think about that. I don't think that's quite right. But anyway, complicated maths. But I think that's about right, about 10%. So yep. So unless there was other tests other than the lateral flow rate tests, that could be somewhere where I've made a mistake, but I don't think so. There may have been some other places I could have made mistakes, but I feel like semi-confident that's about right, about 10% positive rate. And so conclusions is, firstly, yeah, I am a bit like, I thought it would be higher than that, and it's a little bit lower. So tinsy pieces of humble pie, but not major. It's still a chunk, and it's more than 1%. And the other conclusion is that I've been looking at this positive rate graph and thinking, oh, that's the first wave, and there's a second wave, and the second wave is not as bad as the first wave. But actually, I think it probably is worse. When you look at the cases, you don't want to look at that. But then if you look at the prevalence is worse in the second wave. And if you look at the deaths, which is probably one of the most important ones to look at, let's zoom out a bit. The deaths are about a little worse in the second wave. So yeah, that's it. It's still quite bad, but I hope this has been useful for somebody. I'll put all the links down below. Is there anything else? Yeah, our world in Data.org is a good place to go to. Yep, okay, that'll do. See you later.